sing a song of murder. The neon lights of the boulevard flickered through the humid evening air as the bass lines from the nearby club echoed into the empty streets. The legend of Rick Michaels was written in platinum records, screaming fans, and a trail of broken promises that stretched across every continent. Everywhere he went, the music followed, bringing a whirlwind of fame and temporary devotion. The song that defined his career was a simple rhythm, repeating the journey of a man who had seen the world and touched the hearts of many, yet remained fundamentally distant from everyone around him. In the quiet office of Rooney and Page Management, the mood was far from celebratory. Sue Page stood by the window, her silhouette framed by the glowing city below. Philip Rooney was pacing behind his massive oak desk, adjusting his tie with nervous, rhythmic jerks. The tension between them was palpable, built on years of financial miscalculations and the heavy burden of managing a single, unpredictable superstar. Sue turned slowly, her eyes fixing on Mr. O'Rourke, who was gathering his papers with a quiet, practiced composure. The discussion had reached its inevitable conclusion, yet the bitterness remained. She questioned his perspective, emphasizing their position as business managers rather than scavengers feeding off the leftovers of a larger presence. O'Rourke merely offered a dry farewell, leaving the two managers alone with their escalating debt and mounting anxiety. Philip Rooney took a deep breath, trying to inject a note of optimism into the heavy silence. He remarked that Rick seemed to be settling down, given that he had spent 2 consecutive nights with the same companion. But Sue was in no mood for false comfort. She knew the reality of their situation better than anyone. They were staring at bank statements that foretold imminent ruin unless their star attraction stayed on the road and in the studio. Meanwhile, at the secluded estate where Rick Michaels maintained his retreat, the atmosphere was chaotic. Gloria, one of the many acquaintances in Rick's orbit, was making her exit while Smitty, the reliable go-between for the local crowd, kept watch. Down by the newly resurfaced pool, the situation was spiraling out of control. April Dayton, confused, overwhelmed, and suffering from a lack of her required medication, found herself caught in a sudden confrontation. Arguments flared, voices were raised over the ambient noise of running water, and in a single, tragic moment of disorientation, the poolside became the site of a devastating disaster. Across town, Sue Page decided that waiting for the morning was no longer an option. At 2 o'clock in the morning, she insisted on confronting Rick directly to settle the outstanding contract details that stood between their agency and total insolvency. Philip tried to reason with her, pointing out the late hour, the likelihood that Rick was either asleep or entertaining guests, and the sheer impropriety of barging in. Sue dismissed his concerns completely. Her focus was entirely on financial survival. Rick Michaels was their sole income generator, the golden goose she had brought to the firm, and she refused to let their future slip away. When Sue and Philip arrived at the estate, the front gates were unlocked and the grounds were eerily quiet. Near the side entrance, they encountered April Dayton in a state of absolute terror. She was trembling, unable to articulate what had transpired, babbling incoherently about Rick and the pool. Before they could fully grasp her words, she fled into the night, leaving behind only a single shoe embedded in the soft, wet earth near the garden border. Sue walked briskly toward the pool house, calling out Rick's name with increasing impatience. Philip followed closely behind, his heart pounding with a sudden premonition of dread. They turned the corner near the edge of the pool, where the freshly laid plaster was still wet, and stopped dead in their tracks. Rick Michaels lay motionless on the hard surface at the deep end. The pool had been drained for maintenance, and the fall from the diving board had proven fatal. The silence that followed was suffocating. Philip instinctively urged Sue to turn away, pointing out the obvious catastrophe that lay before them. He wondered aloud where the usual crowd of followers had gone, the people who normally surrounded Rick and prevented him from self-destruction. But as Sue coldly noted, no one had ever succeeded in stopping Rick Michaels from doing exactly what he wanted. Philip reached for his coat pocket, intending to call the authorities and an ambulance immediately. Sue grabbed his arm with a grip of iron. She commanded him to stop and think before taking any action. Philip was bewildered, insisting that the young man was dead and that there was nothing left to do except report the tragedy. Sue's mind, however, was already racing down a far darker path. She began to calculate the immense financial domino effect that Rick's death would trigger. Carl Ludwig had millions tied up in the upcoming European concert tour bookings. Earl Sampson had hundreds of thousands invested in the pending album releases and the remaining recording sessions scheduled for the year. If news of Rick's death broke now, those contracts would be canceled instantly, leaving Rooney and Page with nothing but bankrupt estates and endless litigation. Sue presented a chilling proposition to her partner. She suggested that while dead superstars rarely earned commissions for their managers, a missing superstar was another matter entirely. If the industry executives believed Rick had been abducted, they would gladly pay a massive ransom to secure his safe return and protect their vast investments. $500,000, extracted from Ludwig and Sampson under the guise of a ransom payment, would solve all their financial problems. Philip was horrified by the suggestion, calling the scheme insane. He asked how they could possibly account for the missing artist once the money was delivered, or how they would dispose of the evidence. Sue remained coldly pragmatic. The ransom would be collected, the kidnappers would allegedly panic, and the body would simply never be recovered. With cold calculation, she decided to treat the physical evidence as nothing more than debris to be removed before the morning light. By the following morning, the investigation began quietly in a very different setting. Barnaby Jones sat in his private office, reviewing a request brought to him by a concerned friend of April Dayton. Miss Vickers explained that April had made a frantic, terrifying phone call late the previous night, sounding completely disoriented before the line went dead. Vickers was deeply worried, knowing that April was not the type to invent crises, despite her chaotic lifestyle and her struggle with a chronic medical condition that required daily doses of Oronase. Barnaby listened attentively, taking detailed notes on April's background, her associates, and her connection to Rick Michaels. Recognizing the potential danger if a diabetic individual was missing without medication, Barnaby agreed to look into the matter immediately. He secured Rick's home address and began retracing April's steps from the previous evening. Meanwhile, a high-level meeting was taking place at the management offices. Sue Page had summoned the two major music executives, Earl Sampson and Carl Ludwig, along with their associate Bill. The executives were visibly agitated, having been forced to cancel pressing engagements and international flights on short notice. Sue laid the groundwork for the deception with practiced ease. She informed the astonished executives that Rick Michaels had been kidnapped from his residence sometime during the night. To reinforce the story, she produced a carefully crafted ransom demand instructing them to raise $500,000 in unmarked currency. Carl Ludwig and Earl Sampson were thrown into a panic. They debated calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately, but Philip Rooney quickly intervened, warning them that any law enforcement involvement would jeopardize Rick's life. The executives were caught in a trap of their own financial making. They had millions riding on Rick's upcoming appearances and could not afford to lose him. However, a major complication arose when the question of Rick's personal funds was raised. Earl Sampson assumed that Rick's personal accounts could cover the ransom, given the enormous sums paid to him over the previous year. Sue delivered a shocking revelation. Despite his massive income, Rick Michaels was virtually destitute, having squandered his fortune on extravagant gifts, poor investments, and tax liabilities. If the ransom was to be paid, Sampson and Ludwig would have to provide the cash out of their own corporate funds. Driven by the need to salvage their commercial ventures, the executives reluctantly agreed to pool their resources and deliver the money by 5 o'clock that afternoon. While the ransom plot moved forward, Barnaby Jones arrived at Rick's estate to conduct his own inquiries. He was met at the entrance by Sue Page, who maintained an icy, professional exterior. Barnaby explained that he was searching for April Dayton, who had been seen in Rick's company the previous night. Sue dismissed his concerns, denying any knowledge of April's whereabouts and claiming that Rick was far too busy to keep track of every casual acquaintance. Undeterred by Sue's deflection, Barnaby explored the exterior of the property. Near the pool area, He encountered a work crew attempting to repair the damaged plaster at the bottom of the drained pool. The contractor was furious, explaining that someone had turned on the water system around 3 o'clock in the morning, ruining the fresh gunite installation and leaving distinct boot prints and tire tracks in the wet soil near the fence. Barnaby carefully examined the ground, recovering a discarded woman's shoe from the mud. Upon returning to his office, he met with his assistant, Betty, to cross-reference the shoe with April Dayton's possessions. Miss Vickers confirmed that the shoe belonged to April. More importantly, Barnaby noted that April suffered from diabetes, making her prompt discovery a matter of life and death. To narrow down the search, Barnaby had his office contact April's personal physician, Dr. Floyd Hemmings, instructing him to alert them immediately if any pharmacy called in a prescription refill for Oronase. Knowing that April might seek help from informal networks, Barnaby and Miss Vickers set out to locate Smitty, a street-level contact known for supplying under-the-counter assistance to the local music scene. In a quiet apartment across town, Smitty was indeed holding April Dayton in a state of semi-isolation. April was growing increasingly ill without her medication, pleading with Smitty to help her secure a refill. Smitty, realizing that April was unexpectedly central to a major situation involving high-profile people, offered vague reassurances while keeping her secluded until he could determine how best to leverage the situation for his own benefit. As 5 o'clock approached, the ransom exchange was set into motion. Sue Page and Philip Rooney utilized a twin-bag trick involving 2 identical pieces of luxury luggage to manage the drop-off without raising the suspicions of Ludwig and Sampson. Sue instructed the executives to monitor the phone lines while she and Philip took the cash to a designated location in the valley. Barnaby Jones, tracking the physical evidence gathered from the pool area, began connecting the dots. Lab analysis revealed that the blood found on April's shoe did not match her blood type, nor did it match the dried traces found on the pool house telephone extension. Furthermore, microscopic analysis of the soil samples recovered from the scene revealed traces of gunite plaster, crushed granite, and organic waste, suggesting that a heavy burden had been moved from the pool area using a garden wheelbarrow and transported away in a vehicle. Barnaby paid another visit to Sue Page and Philip Rooney at their office. He subtly dropped details about his investigation, mentioning the damaged pool, the blood evidence, and the strange absence of Rick Michaels. Sue attempted to derail his efforts by claiming she had just received a call from April Dayton, who was supposedly relaxing safely at a resort in Palm Springs. Recognizing the claim as a fabricated diversion, Barnaby immediately traveled to the location where Smitty was holding April. Arriving just in time, Barnaby confronted Smitty and secured April's safety, ensuring she finally received her essential medication. Once stabilized, April recounted the events of that fateful night. She explained that she and Rick had been misbehaving near the empty pool late at night. Rick had stepped onto the diving board, lost his footing on the slippery surface, and fallen into the deep end. Terrified and disoriented, April had tried to use the pool house telephone to call for help, but she panicked and fled when she heard incoming footsteps and the voices of Sue Page and Philip Rooney approaching the scene. With April's testimony, the full picture became clear to Barnaby. Rick Michaels had not been kidnapped. He had suffered a severe fall. But the most sinister detail was revealed through chemical testing of the organic residues recovered from the trunk of Philip Rooney's luxury vehicle. Barnaby alerted Lieutenant Valdez of the police department and proceeded to the final showdown at the management office, where Sue and Philip were preparing to divide the $500,000 in ransom money. When Barnaby and the authorities entered the room, Sue Page maintained a defiant posture. She argued that even if their scheme was exposed, they could only be charged with fraud or extortion, since Rick's death had been an accidental fall and April was alive and unharmed. She boasted that they had returned the ransom money and could not be held responsible for a fatal accident that occurred before their arrival. Barnaby looked at Sue and Philip with grave solemnity. He corrected her dangerous miscalculation. He explained that forensic examination by the coroner had established a definitive timeline using chemical analysis of the air exposure and traces of sulfur compound decomposition found on the body. Rick Michaels had not died immediately from the fall into the pool. He was merely unconscious when Sue Page and Philip Rooney discovered him. In their desperate greed to stage a kidnapping and collect the ransom money, they had sealed the unconscious artist inside a heavy transport bag and moved him to the city dump. The coroner's report confirmed that Rick Michaels had survived the impact, only to perish from asphyxiation inside the sealed container. The room fell into an absolute, icy silence as Lieutenant Valdez moved in to place handcuffs on both Sue Page and Philip Rooney. The charge facing them was not merely financial fraud or extortion, but first-degree murder. The song of Rick Michaels had finally come to its end, leaving behind a stark reminder of the tragic costs of unchecked ambition and greed.